When you hear this, what do you feel? At IMAX, you'll feel transported by our unique sound system and crystal clear images. Like you're running across a desert planet or defending your city from a surprise invasion. With immersive IMAX sound and screens curved to show more, we take fans to the edge of their seats. Get tickets to Dune Part 2 now and experience it in IMAX's exclusive expanded aspect ratio.
Forgiveness is a critical part in any relationship. In order to be successful in marriage, we need to learn how to forgive our wife, and wives need to learn how to forgive their husbands. This is actually one of those principles that's for the person who is forgiving as opposed to the person that needs to be forgiven, so that way that person can heal. Today, that's what we're going to explore and unpack, so stay tuned. Hey, welcome back to another podcast right here in Coach's Corner. Last week, you heard me talking all about trust and the importance of that, and part of that building trust is learning to forgive. So that is what we are going to unpack today. Now, before we get too far, I do want to make you aware of a few different things. First, there is a link down in the description box. If you would like to support this podcast, you can buy me a coffee. That goes towards rebuilding or purchasing equipment for this podcast to make it that much better and hopefully that much more enjoyable for those of you who are getting value out of this. And I greatly appreciate anyone who supports this podcast in that way. And for those of you looking to get more value out of this podcast, consider going to that Patreon page and joining the community, because I got a lot of great resources available for my Patreon community. If for whatever reason your platform allows you to comment, rate, subscribe, follow, I greatly appreciate that. And those of you who have responded, in a lot of the episodes, you'll see a poll or a question. This is only going to be on Spotify. So if you're on a different platform, look up this podcast on Spotify and answer the poll or the question, because that really does help me direct where the next episodes are going. Now, if you have a episode topic that you would really like to hear me share with the community, or you just got a question that you really want to get unpacked, then send me an email, husbandcoach2020@gmail.com. That's also in the show notes or the description, so you can get a hold of me and just let me know what it is that would like to hear about. And I'll definitely see what I can do. If it's not a topic that I am well versed in, I'll let you know that, but we'll still explore how we can help unpack that, even if it's something that I'm not entirely sure on. So forgiveness, let's talk about that. It can be tricky, right? I'm not one of those people that's going to sit here and tell you like, oh yeah, just forgive and forget. That's a dumb phrase, all right? We don't forget. In fact, we forgive and then we remember, and then we have to remember that we forgave. And we're going to unpack that here in the episode, because that is a common issue that I personally have had. And sometimes, if I'm being honest, I still have that issue, right? I will forgive my wife for something, and then, 2-3 months down the road, something else comes up. It's like, oh man, that still bothers me. But I have to remember that I did forgive her. And, we're going to really talk about that. But forgive and forget, like whatever your parents may have taught you as a kid, throw that out the window, because that's not a real thing. I'm sorry. And that's not, for me to dig at your parents or anything like that. There's no such thing as forgive and forget. We don't do that as people. All right. When we get scarred, we can overcome the situation. We can forgive the person to mend the relationship. We don't forget. We will remember. And when we remember, that's going to trigger some emotions. And when those emotions are triggered, that's when we have to remember that we have already forgiven for that situation. So we have to let those emotions go. It can be tricky though, because trust me, I understand. Now, when you learn to forgive in your marriage, you will continue to build the environment for you and your wife to be successful. And that's what we are going to be looking at in today's episode and really unpacking. The number one question that I get from a lot of people is, well, Chris, why in the world should I even forgive? I would hope that that's pretty straightforward and self-explanatory, but for anyone who is wondering, like, why should I even forgive? It's just so much easier to be angry. I don't know why this is, but in my experience of coaching husbands, most of the time it's the wife that is really holding that grudge against the the husband. And I know that there are some husbands out there that are holding grudges against their wives and they haven't forgiven. And that's where I really hone in and focus. But whenever I go over this segment of forgiveness, the most common response is, I don't have a problem with this. My wife is the one who won't let this thing go. And so I'm constantly having to uh, re respond to her in a loving way so that way I can eventually be forgiven. And it's like I have to earn the forgiveness. And that's actually one of the first things that I want to tell you on why you should forgive. Don't make your wife, and wives that are listening, don't make your husbands feel that they have to earn forgiveness, because that means that you are guilt tripping them into being forgiven. All right. If you're going to forgive them, it needs to be a decision that you make of your own choice. You have to say, okay, you know what? I'm going to forgive you because I think that this is one of those areas that we can move past. So I'm going to forgive you. And then you start working on whatever it is that you need to work on. So that way you can truly heal from this. All right. Healing doesn't start by guilt tripping your spouse. It just doesn't. It starts when you make a decision that you're ready to start healing. If you aren't ready to start healing, then you're not going to be ready to forgive, which means you're going to continue every time that this is brought up or something similar to it is brought up, you're going to hurt that much more. Ultimately, the forgiveness is for the person who was hurt. And when you start to forgive, or when you make the decision, I'm going to forgive, you start that healing process. And that's why you need to forgive. First, that we're not guilt tripping our spouse into thinking that they have to earn forgiveness, because it's not even for them, by the way, it's for you. And then two, it is for you to start healing. So that's like the very first thing that I tell people. You have to make this decision to want to forgive your spouse so that way you can heal. Because if you don't want to heal and you think that if I forgive my spouse, then that's going to make me weak and it's going to make me give up my high ground, then you're already missing the point, because what you're looking for is retaliation, and we don't want retaliation. All right. That's not what I'm teaching. That's not where you want to go with this. Where you really want to go with this is knowing that your wife or your husband, if you're a wife listening to this, is able to understand that now you're about to move forward. All right. And begin the healing process. So that's the first reason why you should forgive. It also keeps you from building resentment. When we don't learn to forgive, we end up resenting our spouse. And if we start to resent our spouse, when that happens, there are so many problems that we encounter in our relationships that it feels like we're always in an uphill battle. And every time that I coach a husband and we're talking about this, we always go back to like, hey, what was the first time or the most common time that you can remember that you and your wife are constantly at conflict? And that usually results in some form of unmet need that hasn't been forgiven. Now, I won't say that this is a common thing. It's not like always the case, but most of the time, whenever I talk to a husband, that's where it's at. All right. Now, in the past, I have done couples.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Ewan McGregor stars as Count Alexander Rostov in A Gentleman in Moscow, the new limited series based on the best-selling novel. Stream it on March 29th with the Paramount Plus with Showtime plan. Visit ParamountPlus.com to try it free.
Counseling where we have talked about what it is that they haven't forgiven each other for. And, some things really come out that it surprises the other person. Like, wait a minute, you're still carrying this hurt from a thing that happened 7, 10, 15 years ago? That is crazy. That is crazy. And it's not crazy in the regards of like the person is crazy. It's crazy in the regards of this is going to hurt the marriage. And because of that, we need to really build a more forgiving environment, right? And that's actually the second reason, which is or I guess I don't know what number reason it is. Doesn't matter. My notes aren't numbered. It's a toxic environment if you don't forgive. And a lot of people, they experience that on a daily basis because we as people love to pull up the past and hold that against the person in the present. And that is such a detrimental thing to our relationships. What I want to encourage everyone, why should I forgive? Is one, because it starts the healing process for you. Two, is a combatant, or it combats directly resentment towards your spouse. So that way you don't wake up 4 years down the road and be like, you know what, I hate you. Like I've heard in many cases in the past. Also, it helps combat that toxic. Now that we know why we should forgive, let's talk about how do I forgive my spouse? How do I forgive my spouse? This is one of those things where it varies. So I'm going to give just some very general groundwork, and you're going to have to figure out how this really plays into your relationship, because your relationship is going to be different than mine, than the people that I've counseled in the past. There's going to be some similarities, but because it's not the two same people or the same two people, it's going to be different. So now that we know the reason why we should forgive, let's talk about how do I forgive. The first thing, you got to name the situation, name the problem, name it. Say whatever it is that the wrong was, because if you don't know what was wrong, then you're going to run into issues. All right. We need to identify that up front. And then I want you to go into a grieving process. Now, I'm not saying like you should sob over this. Sometimes it's going to take you to crying, and that's okay. All right. Go find a place, let out all of your frustration, grieve over the wrong. Because if you don't allow yourself the time to really just let out your emotional frustration with whatever the thing is, then it's going to be one of those, it's going to start to build resentment because you haven't truly dealt with it. Now, remember, you've already made the decision, you're ready to heal. And part of the healing process to being done wrong is that you grieve over the issue. Not everything's going to require tears. Grieving looks different for everyone. This could be you going and venting to someone about the situation. This could be you going to the gym and working out. Maybe you got to lift some weights. Maybe you go for a long run just to clear your head, whatever it may be. This could be writing stuff down on paper, just getting all of your emotions out. Whatever you need to do to really address the situation that happened to you and say, okay, I'm really not happy with this because I was done wrong. All right. If you don't do that, then you're not going to start the healing process and you're not going to be ready to forgive. So you have to go through the grieving process, whatever that looks like for you. Adapt that for your life, for your marriage, for your personality, for your character, whatever it is, adapt that appropriately for you. This does not mean during the grieving process, you should start scheming to retaliate towards your wife. And if you're a wife listening to this, retaliating towards your husband, right? You stole $50 from me, I'm gonna steal $100 from you. That's not the way that this works, right? Because now you're at this toxic battle back and forth of who can hurt who the most. That's not what we're trying to do. Or it should be anything else, like I'm going to go cheat on my wife, or I'm going to go cheat on my husband because this is what happened, and really care for that, or any form of getting even, right? Don't do that during the retaliation piece. Doing these things in a very controlled environment is important, right? You want to be in a controlled environment because if you go and you do this, let's say you go vent to someone who doesn't have your best interest in mind or your marriage's best interest in mind. And interestingly enough, my wife and I, we went out for a date last night, and during our date, she brought up a friend who helped her through an issue when my wife needed to forgive me. All right. We had a disagreement. My wife didn't give me details, so I don't know. But all I know is she had two friends that she told this to. One of her friends told her to leave me. And I don't know what I would have done to make her say, yeah, you should leave, Chris. That's just weird. But that's the advice that her friend gave her. My wife identified that that's a toxic and uncontrolled environment because that's just feeding into her grief. and it's not actually helping her heal. My wife had already made the decision that she was ready to heal, but she was looking for someone to talk to that was going to give her count or productive advice on how to deal with the situation. Mind you, we were probably in our young 20s or early 20s. We were young relative to today. And she went to a different friend who gave her advice on how to work through it and told her, hey, this isn't going to be easy, but this is something that you and Chris can really overcome. And we worked through it. Now, I am grateful for the second friend. And I'm sure that the first friend, that advice that she gave was probably stemming from her upbringing, her experiences, what she's witnessed, or what her ideas on marriage really are. And it didn't match with what my wife's and my ideas of marriage really are, which is we are committed to one another until the end. So, when we go back to talking about commitment and covenant and joining in matrimony, that is the foundation of everything that my wife and I have. And I encourage that you and your wife figure that out as well, because it really does give a strong backbone to your relationship of, okay, we're going to figure this out together. Regardless of what the issue is, we're going to figure this out together and we're going to move forward and we're going to care for one another and love one another. And that's exactly what we ended up doing in this situation, because my wife said, well, wait a minute, that's not what my husband and I agreed on. So now I have to figure this out. And she found a friend who was actually going to help figure it out. So that is the benefit of having a controlled environment. So that way you don't go off the hinge and go in a direction that you ultimately weren't trying to go into. All right. Because the healing process and the forgiveness that I'm talking about keeps couples together, because the whole idea and the reason I started this podcast was to help husbands learn to love their wives every day, become better men in the process, but also enriching and bringing value to marriages. All right. I'm not here supporting divorce. I'm not supporting it. All right. Till this day, I have not found a situation that a couple has not been able to work through. Now, there have been many situations where couples chose not to work through it, but I've never found one where a couple couldn't work. Now, how do I know I've actually forgiven my spouse? This is actually a huge one, and I don't have really enough time to unpack all of the aspects. But number one, you're not going to retaliate against your spouse whenever the situation comes up again, where you're like, yeah, I got to get even with her, or I got to get even with him, whatever the case may be, right? When you have fully healed, or at least you have gotten to the point of healing where it's like, okay, I know I'm not going to retaliate, you know that you've forgiven. That can happen in an instant. It really can. Because when you don't want to retaliate, that means that you're not looking to get to settle a score. That means you're looking to heal still, and you may have a year, 2 years, whatever it may be, depending on the hurt. You're going to have some time that you have to take to heal. But when you don't want to retaliate, you know that you've forgiven. The other time that you know that you've forgiven is when your emotional issues, your emotional stress, your emotional burden about the situation, about the wrong, has gone down over time. I'm not here to propose that you forgive overnight and you just become like an instant forgiver, right? I don't know of too many people who are like that. I'm not like that. So I wouldn't encourage anyone to even consider an instant overnight forgiving. Now, if that's something you can do, then and you want to try that, go for it. But instead, what I really want you to focus on is, how triggered am I by the event? And how triggered am I by the event when I think about it down the line? If you're not overly emotional, because you're going to be emotional, right? Because it still hurt. Scars leave marks and they tell stories of incidents in the past. The same idea is happening whenever we are experiencing these emotional issues with our spouse. So that's okay though. It's really, how emotional am I? Am I just as emotional as I was the day that it happened, or am I less emotional today? And if you're less emotional, then you have started the forgiveness process. And as long as you're not retaliating or looking to get even, you can even say that I've forgiven this person, but it still hurts. That is a whole different idea. All right. Whole different ball game. It's going to hurt. Forgiveness doesn't remove the pain of whatever the wrong was. It doesn't. What it means is you're not going to hold that grudge against the person that you want to get even. Okay. And it also doesn't mean that you blame the person within reason, right? Because I could just see a lot of people who have counter ideas about this. So let me just explain what I mean. You're not blaming your wife, or you as a wife aren't blaming your husband about the pain that you feel, but instead you're sharing the pain so that you two can work through it. Because if you hold your husband responsible for the pain, or if you hold your wife responsible for the pain that you're feeling, then you haven't truly forgiven. Because what you're doing is you're trying to make that person feel guilty. And that goes back to the first reason that we are not forgiving or waiting to forgive to hold a person guilty, because that's retaliation and that's holding a grudge, and that's not helpful. It really isn't. Let me be honest with you. Sometimes it feels like you are giving up a lot when you forgive a person, because our society and our culture has told us that we have to get even. Things are supposed to be fair. Let me be the first to tell you, if you haven't heard this already, life isn't fair. And anyone who says things should be fair, just they're living in la la land. I won't insult, but it just upsets me when people are telling me like, oh, everything needs to be equal and everything needs to be fair. That's not life. That's not the way reality actually works. It sounds good and it gets people inspired to do things and to try to fight for fairness. And there are things that we should be equal in, right? But when it comes to forgiveness, you're likely going to give up a lot in order to forgive a person that we would claim to be our right. Like, I have the right to be mad at this person right now. The reality is, when you decide to remain mad at your spouse, think of all the time that you're missing of building your relationship to a more healthy place and a more loving place and a more welcoming place. If you took the time to build your marriage, your relationship, and to forgive your spouse, think of all of the time that you could be spending enjoying your relationship, as opposed to saying, you know what, I blame you for my problem. Those are two different relationships, two different marriages. And the one that learns to forgive is going to be that much more successful. And that's the reason why you have to learn to forgive. So if you found value in this episode, smash the like button, subscribe, comment, send me an email, husbandcoach2020@gmail.com. It's down in the description box. And if you want to support the show, then consider buying me a coffee. Or if you want to go deeper, consider joining the Patreon community. And I'd love to see you in there. So until next time, I want you to find a way to love your wife every day.